Our second lesson this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him, and calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Most of us probably know that Albert Einstein was a physicist who pioneered the theory of relativity and came up with that famous equation, E equals mc squared. While I was in seminary in Princeton, New Jersey, Einstein's mythology took on a whole new dimension, so to speak, since the house where he lived while he worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies is a landmark right near the seminary campus. Recently, I've been reading a biography of Einstein, and it became quickly clear to me that I really didn't know anything about Einstein as a person. It turns out he showed few signs of genius as a child or even a young adult. He graduated college near the bottom of his class, and it took him years to find a job at a university where he actually got paid to teach and research and refine his ideas. He got married, and then he went through a bitter divorce after having an affair with his first cousin. He had a child out of wedlock whom he never laid eyes on. Most of us think of Einstein as this mythical genius who transformed our understanding of space and time, but it turns out he was utterly human, as flawed as you and me. Reading this biography while preparing for a sermon about the Magi, it has occurred to me that something similar has happened to us with this story. The Magi have assumed status of mythical proportions. Think of all the details that have been added to Matthew's sparse account over the years and extolled in stories, hymns, and art. Here are a few things, none of which are found in Matthew's account, that most of us take for granted about the Magi: that there were 3 of them, that they were all men, that they were wise, that they were kings, that they rode camels. At the risk of rendering all of our nativity scenes inaccurate, the fact is none of these details are in the text. The text refers to magi, a Greek word from which we get our word magician, and states that they came from the east and that the star they saw guides them not directly to that stable in Bethlehem, but to Herod's palace in Jerusalem. They were, after all, looking for a king. From Jerusalem, Herod sends them on to Bethlehem, and once they're back on the road, the star reappears and leads them to what must have been the least likely king they could have ever imagined. Finally, reaching the end of their journey, they discover a poor newborn baby and his unremarkable peasant parents surrounded by animals in a dusty stable. So Einstein had this unusual way of coming up with his theories. He had an incredible imagination and an extraordinary ability to conduct thought experiments, no lab required. To imagine, for example, what it might be like to ride alongside a light beam, or to accelerate through deep space in a closed box like an elevator. Through such thought experiments, he would intuit certain principles and properties of space and time and light and matter, but often it would then take years for Einstein and his contemporaries to put mathematical formulas to his ideas. Along the way, there were many times Einstein would go down paths that turned out to be total dead ends. Other times, he refused to go down paths that the experiments indicated were the right ones, because they headed in the exact opposite direction that he would have expected, based on centuries of accepted scientific principles. Einstein's discoveries ultimately required us to rethink many of these principles, including the foundations of Newtonian physics and Euclidean geometry. When the Magi first saw that star in the sky that heralded the birth of a new king, they thought they knew what they would find when they followed it. They had used their knowledge of astrology and prophecy and determined what this star predicted, the birth of a king. So they must have assumed, as we usually do, that if they followed it, they would be led to something, to someone who fit their current understanding of births and kings, not to a backwater town, a crowded stable, and a manger serving as a king's cradle. Perhaps this is why they brought these gifts. Gifts that in some ways seem completely inappropriate for a baby. Gold for royalty, frankincense for religious ceremonies, and myrrh, which was used to prepare corpses for burial. What kind of a visitor to a new baby brings a gift suited for a funeral? Can you imagine showing up to a baby shower with an urn? Well, like Einstein, who had this gift for determining the end point before figuring out exactly what it meant to get there, whether they knew it or not, the Magi brought a gift that might have been the most appropriate gift of all for a baby who was God incarnate, the divine in human flesh. For what is more human than death? What reveals more the extraordinary nature of this divine birth than the fact that Jesus, as the hymn puts it, was born to die? Imagine Mary putting these gifts on the bookshelf in Jesus' room so that he might see them every day of his childhood and adolescence and young adulthood. Could it be that these strange gifts might serve for Jesus as a kind of guide, just like the star was for the Magi, just like a star word can be for us throughout the coming year? How might these gifts, symbolizing royalty, divinity, and death, have reminded Jesus who he was and to whom he belonged? How might they have guided him on his journey from the manger to the cross? The poet T.S. Eliot is among those who have taken liberties in imagining and embellishing this story. In his poem, The Journey of the Magi, he recounts the journey from the perspective of one of them, now an old man, looking back on this experience that changed his life forever. It is not a pleasant recollection, for he recalls a difficult journey. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter, the night fires going out and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile and the towns unfriendly and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. He recalls when they finally arrived at a strange and unexpected place just in time for the birth. The rest of the poem is evidence that this journey and its destination were life-changing, so that once the man got back home, things could not be the same. Looking back now, he wonders, was it a birth they experienced or a death? All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again, but set down this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. As Eliot knows, birth is always accompanied by death. Transformation is always an experience of death. Something has to die to make way for what is new. When we have experienced any kind of birth, we can't go back to the places we came from without feeling like we no longer belong in the way we once did. So I hope you got your star word today, and hopefully that word is something you have some understanding of and some idea of how it might apply to your life. But I predict that over the next year, something will happen as you ponder this word, and I invite you to put it somewhere where you will see it and ponder it. Something not unlike what happened to the Magi as they followed their star and took this long journey and then found themselves in the last place they expected, on their knees, worshiping a most unusual king, overwhelmed with joy by the love of a God they did not even know existed. Last year, when we gave out star words, I put mine in a shelf above my desk where I saw it nearly every day. The word was perseverance, and wouldn't you know it, the same one I drew today. So last year, I had a pretty good idea of what that meant for me when I first got it, but my year took some unexpected detours, as things usually do, and along the way, the word took on new meaning. It resonated in my life in ways I could not have predicted, and eventually it became a sign for me, not so much of my perseverance, but God's. God's persistent presence, God's relentless desire to be with me through all kinds of challenges. This word became a reminder that while it is important to keep the end of the journey in mind, what perhaps matters more is knowing and remembering who we are and to whom we belong along the way. After Einstein's theory of general relativity was proven by measurements taken during a rare solar eclipse, the New York Times headline read, "Lights all askew in the heavens. Men of science more or less agog over results of eclipse observations. Stars not where they seemed or were calculated to be, but nobody need worry." Our lives, our relationships, our journeys of faith, our whole broken world, chances are none of them are what they seemed or were calculated to be. The equations we thought would be reliable theoretical predictors have a tendency to break down when put into practice. What we thought was birth turns out to contain a kernel of death, and what we thought was death turns out to hold a seed of new life. But nobody need worry, for the child whose birth and death are at the heart of this story, at the heart of all our stories, guides us and goes with us. We are guided by our God, who will stop at nothing to reveal God's love and care, who uses the most unlikely elements of our lives to lead us in our journey. It is a journey of transformation and discovery and astonishing surprises, a journey on which we might just learn that death is not the worst thing, and that love, the most persistent and powerful force in all of God's universe, both cradles and guides us all. Amen.